Hey there, everybody. Today I have a guest that I've been really excited to bring on because she is talking my language, and I'm just so excited to have this conversation. Tonia Braddock is an intuitive empath specialized in quantum healing hypnosis, EFT tapping. We don't know anything about that here. And the emotion code, where she dives deep into subconscious mind to assist and teach people how to tap into their own inner healer naturally and intuitively. Now, Tanya hosts the Existential Empath podcast, which is where we connected, where she shares tips and techniques on how to strengthen one's intuitive gifts to allow major shifts in consciousness to take place. Tanya worked in the healthcare field for nearly 15 years where she experienced many paranormal experiences, which opened her up to understanding her abilities on a much deeper level. She also has the ability to activate people in their own knowledge of light language to assist with elevating one's consciousness. Tanya, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am so excited to be here.
So, the piece that you were talking about, that you were in the healthcare field for nearly 15 years, where you experienced many paranormal experiences because you were working in organ donation. That was one of the big reasons why I was like, oh my God, we have to have this conversation. But then you told me that you grew up around funeral homes, which is why this show is called Living with the Departed. But before we dive into the whole communing with the dead and talking with people on the other side and all of that, I want to talk about you and where the whole story begins, what your experience was like as a highly sensitive little kid. Did you know you were an empath? So paint the picture. Tell us the story. Where does it all start?
Absolutely. So I grew up in Western New York in a very small town out in the country. So when you think of Western New York, it's not New York City, it's more Amish country. And so I lived next to a river, and majority of the time I spent as a child was outdoors. I mean, I was constantly in nature. And as a child, I remember very specifically having telepathic communications with animals and elementals. And my friends would have parties where we would actually go out into the woods and search for fairies and different elementals and whatnot. And, as a child, I always thought that was really fun. But the reality is I remember seeing these things and communicating with these things. So asking me if I knew I was an empath at that time, I would probably have to say no.
Mm-hmm.
But now as an adult, of course, I look back and I'm like, wow, I was extremely tuned in to nature and to the subtle energies in the subtle realms. And so, I remember my parents always saying that I was the sensitive one. They would always use those words. And I never really understood what that meant. I think it's because I would go to school and I would come home, I would cry, I would be holding, emotions of those around me. And I was always a really caring, compassionate kid. I always friended the kids that didn't have a lot of friends, or I would kind of comfort the children that were hurting, or, I always found myself doing that. And that went out through my whole life. And I think that's what led me into working in healthcare. I had been working, my first job was a nonprofit. I worked for a blood bank. And then I moved into hospice care for a while. I had worked, and now I'm not a nurse. Right. I was never a nurse. I was always working more on the administrative side of things, or the marketing end of things. But with that said, when you work in nonprofits, you kind of wear many hats. And so I was kind of being guided into all these different positions, within these companies. And so at hospice, I found myself, we had just built a brand new hospice house. And I had found myself kind of gravitating towards it and being there with those who were crossing over. And I just remember hearing voices. I remember seeing mists. I remember having these experiences, which I did as a child too, but I think I may have shut it off for a while. And I think many of us do as empaths, right? Because I do remember very clearly when I was a child sharing with my friends at school that I could talk to animals, and I got picked on. a lot.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
right.
Yes.
So I'm
Yeah,
wondering
you
if
have
that's when
this
I shut it off.
you have sort of like the special weird like witchy friends who like like you all hang out and like after school and you get the Ouija board or the other stuff, but like you're kind of in these like little kind of secret clubs where it's like you share
Yes.
your magic, and then but in school you're trying to pass as a normal person. Some of us do better than others. I didn't do so well with that passing, but um so you talk about, and I just, it's funny. I'm actually fairly familiar with that part of, that part of New York. Like I used to go to this gathering for many, many, many years, about an hour out of Jamestown. And so, that kind
Oh,
of
it was
farm.
probably the Casadega of the North. Oh, what's it called? I can't remember. But when I lived in Florida, they had a spiritual camp called Casadega, and it was a secondary home to the one in Western New York. And it's right there, just near Jamestown. Yeah.
Well, this was a gathering that there was a bunch of different events that happened, and one was called Starwood that always happened in July. And the place is called Brushwood, and it was like this really, but and really rustic, really like, and so you just like go there and spend like a week off the grid, but like driving through like up and down the rolling hills through the horse country, and really, really magical, beautiful, beautiful land out there. Very lovely. So I can just imagine where you grew up. I also spent my childhood out in the gardens looking for the fairies, trying to communicate, and like communicating with them and stuff like that. So that I can totally relate. So let's talk about funeral homes.
Okay. So I grew up, okay, so not my parents didn't own the funeral home, but my uncle owned the funeral home. And this
Mhm.
funeral home had gone down, through the family line. And my dad had spent a lot of time there. He would go, my dad was a contractor, so he would go and fix up the home, but their funeral home was actually their home. So they, it was like one of those olden time funeral homes where they had the big picture window in the front where they would place the deceased, and then people would say their goodbyes. And so, I spent a lot of time with my cousins around this, and seeing all of this death. And I do remember being around animals that would die too. And I would hold my hands over them in a way that it was almost like I was healing animals, at this time as a child. And so, when I started to move into high school, I started to just become a little bit more infatuated with death a little bit. I thought that was the direction I wanted to go. I thought I wanted to be a mortician. I thought I wanted to take over my uncle's funeral home. So when I started to go off into college, I took a class called Death and Dying.
Mhm.
And in that class, I had to do some sort of an internship type, deal. And I chose to go shadow my uncle at the funeral home. Well, when I went to go do that, I didn't really realize how sensitive I was going to be, not to the spirits, but to the chemicals, to the formaldehyde, to the embalming fluids, to all of that. And so I knew that that was not going to be my path. I knew that there was something with death that I was meant to work with, the other side, but I knew it wasn't meant to be physically like in that capacity. So I had spent a little bit of time with him to learn that process, and I realized that was not for me. And so as I moved through college, then I went through, I got into communications, and then that's when I started to move into more of the nonprofits and the hospices. But then after hospice, that's when I moved into working for an organ procurement organization. And I worked with funeral homes. I worked with medical examiners' offices. I worked with hospitals. Oftentimes I was reviewing medical charts right there in the morgue, so I was really getting to a point where I was around death almost every single day, because I was in the intensive care units, the emergency departments, working with families who had just lost their loved ones. And at this time, this is a very demanding job. It takes up a
Mhm.
lot of energy, a lot of emotion, behind that, a lot of physical effort. I was putting in long hours, very long hours, because people don't just die at 9 to 5, so
No.
it's like, right. So I was having to respond oftentimes late at night to do education and whatnot. And then I would be sometimes assisting our coordinators in the operating room during the organ recoveries. And this is when I started to really notice my gifts were beginning to really pick up. I noticed it specifically at first, just interacting with the staff. I noticed that I would be, in the morning, I'd be great. And then by the time I got to the hospital, I'd interact with some staff and I would recognize that I was sad for the rest of the
Mm.
day, or I
Mhm.
was heavy. I felt burdened. And I would listen to their stories of how they were caring for the patients and the families. And I was taking this on.
Yeah.
This is when I started to understand the true concept of being an empath or being empathic.
Yes.
And oh, Jennifer, that was probably those 5 or 6 years before I actually learned what was happening were intense for me. I started to suffer with severe pain in my body. I'd go to the doctor. They'd say I had fibromyalgia. I wasn't taking that as, my diagnoses. And so then that's when I really dove into the energy work, the energy psychology. And, it took me along that path. But during that process, I started to have dreams about my donors, about the donors that I was caring for. I was working with these families. And then I started to have dreams about them. And they were sending me messages in these dreams to relate to the families. And it started to scare me. It was really scaring me. And this wasn't every single one of them, but there were certain ones that I would get really close to the families. And then I would go home that night and have what appeared to be a very lucid or astral projection type dream. I mean, it was extremely real, extremely vivid. And I remember specifically the first time it happened, it was a young man. He was probably in his 40s and he was in the back of his pickup truck. And his Labrador retriever had actually tripped him and he had fallen out of the truck and hit his head. And it resulted in him being an organ donor. And this
Oh,
family, I was really working heavily with them, with our coordinator, because they wanted donation very desperately. Well, the mom was grieving terribly, just grieving. She was having because this was such a freak accident,
mhm.
I
Mhm.
remember that night, and it wasn't because donation it's a process. It's not like you just go in one day and then the next day we're recovering. It's usually anywhere
It's
from
not like
40.
Grey's Anatomy.
No, definitely. For all you that have seen those shows, it is nothing like that. Absolutely nothing like that. And so, we were spending a lot of time caring for that family. And so I remember I went home. It was probably the third night that we had been working with that family. And I had a very vivid dream. And I'm not going to share all the details just out of respect for the family in case they're listening. But I had held on to that information because at the time I thought, that's crazy. There's no way that he's communicating with me to tell his mom this. And, well, a year goes by and we used to have these beautiful ceremonies for the donor families that were called flag raising ceremonies at the hospital. And I would coordinate them. Well, this family showed up and this family sought me out because they wanted to see me. These families like to see those that they worked with, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
This family sought me out and somehow I got into a conversation with this donor's mom. And I had brought up that I had had a dream about him, like about 3 nights, into the process. And I had shared with her the dream, just kind of, I was doing it nonchalantly because I just thought I'm just sharing a story of what happened. Well, Jennifer, her jaw dropped.
Mhm.
And she says, Tonia, that is exactly what I have been praying for. That is exactly the information that I wanted, that I needed. And you just gave that to me. And I was like, I think that was my aha moment of, whoa, the deceased are talking to me. I think before you could just you could push it to the side. And then this one, it's like it really hit home that I have mediumship abilities and psychic abilities. So then of course I wanted to learn more, so that's when I started going to that little spiritualist camp there in Florida called Casadega. And I got certified and I got attuned in Reiki,
Mhm.
and then that led me into EFT tapping and
Mhm.
then into the emotion code and then into, of course, quantum healing hypnosis. But one story I do want to share that I had touched on in my show with you that you're like, please share this story, was when we would work with the families, our volunteers would actually quilt or knit beautiful blankets, okay, for these donors that we would take into the hospital and we would lay them on the patients in the room prior to them going to the operating room. And then that blanket would go home with the family kind of as a keepsake.
Mm.
Well, I got to a point where I would go into the room. Now, these patients were declared brain dead. They had no longer any cessation of, any activity. They had been declared. And in the state of Florida, it required 2 brain death notes. So they were declared. And I would go in oftentimes and have conversations. So not when the staff was in there. It was usually me by myself. But I would have conversations with the patient. Okay. And I would notice I was hearing information. So I started to tune into what types of colors they liked, because I would go back and pick out a blanket specifically for this donor. And I would do this. And I think it was more of an impression that I would get. It was like, okay, I feel that they really love purple, or they really love green. And I would go back and just kind of, we had maybe 50 blankets in the office. So I would kind of just wave my hand over them and see which one I felt really strongly guided to. And I'm telling you, Jennifer, every single time I hit the nail on the head. And when I would give these blankets to the family, their eyes would just bug out and they'd be like, this is their favorite color. How did you know this? Or this was their favorite football team, and these are the colors of that team, or whatever it may be. And my coworkers were like, how are you so good at this? So it got to a point where they'd have me pick out the blankets every time. They didn't really realize what was going on. And quite honestly, I don't even really know if I realized what was going on at the time. But this became almost like, it became very rewarding for me, because I knew I was giving something to the patient and the family that was of value to them, that was meaningful for them to take home. And I was really picking these sentimental gifts, so to speak, for them to take home. But I wanted to share that story because that is something that's so subtle that not everybody picks up on, but it was something that I started to develop my spiritual gifts, and it allowed me to kind of tune in a little bit better.
Awesome. For some reason, I keep thinking about that Labrador and wondering if there was anything in the message about the lab, because and like what happened with the dog?
No, the dog was fine. Actually, the dog was fine. They actually brought the dog in to say goodbye to him
Oh,
at
good.
the hospital, but it
Hmm.
had to do with a location of an object, something that she was looking for
Hmm.
within the home that had to do with his death, and it
Hmm.
had to do with that. So
Yeah.
yeah, but it was like, whoa, and then I would have dreams, and I still do occasionally have dreams of some of my donors. I know I had one coworker who was a really good friend of mine, highly intuitive. And she, to this day, still has a little 4-year-old boy that communicates with her from working in the field,
Oh,
in donation. And she just felt comforted. But I do remember one time, Jennifer, we were in the operating room and we were at a trauma center. And I was in the room with maybe 6 or 7 different staff. The surgeons are in there, and all the scrub techs. Well, it was a young child, I think under the age of 5. And I remember I was kind of standing on the outskirts because I didn't have all the gear on. I was just kind of on the outskirts. Well, I watched one of the nurses, and her eyes just got really big. She looked straight up in the air, and she put her hands up and she said, "I'm out of here. I can't do this." And so I kind of followed her out and I said, "Are you okay? What happened?" And she goes, "I just saw the spirit of that little boy. It was floating above his body." And I said to her, I said, "I can't see it. I hadn't developed that gift yet where I could see it, but I could sense it and I could feel it and I could hear it, because I have very powerful clairsentience and clairaudience."
hmm.
Well, clearly she had clairvoyance and she was
Hmm.
seeing it. And so in that moment, I felt as if I kind of helped her. I kind of calmed her down and said, "You obviously are empathic. You definitely have psychic abilities." And she said, "Oh my gosh." She says, "I see these things all the time." She goes, "But this is my first organ donor, and it was a child." And she said that,
Mm.
was so vivid and intense. So, I started to be able to utilize my psychic abilities in those situations, because a lot of nursing staff, a lot of people in healthcare are empaths.
Yes.
And they
Yes.
don't know it. They're empaths and they don't realize
Right.
it.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And so I
Well,
was able to help people.
so often people go into the helping professions because, we feel better when other people feel better. And, and it just makes total sense that we do that. So Tanya, I want to circle back to the experience. Like, I'm really curious about what it was like being in the funeral home as a child. Were your cousins sensitive as well? Like, what was happening? Like, and have you and your cousins talked now as adults?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there were two of them, and one of them was more sensitive to the other. Now, I do question, were they both sensitive and the other one was just shutting it off? But I was home about a year ago and I had the opportunity to chat with one of my cousins firsthand about some of her experiences. And they would tune into things. They would hear things all the time, voices, objects would move, and I remember specifically one time I was there playing and we were just playing with a ball. I mean, I was probably 8 or 9 and my dad was doing some work and I would go down there with him from time to time, play with my cousins, because it was a small town. It was maybe 2 miles away, and we were playing and we were just throwing the ball around back and forth, and it had actually bounced down the stairs into the embalming room. And my cousin said, "Go get the ball." And I was like, okay. I didn't even think twice about it. Well, I had gotten down there and there was two bodies in there, two bodies. And it didn't phase me. It didn't even phase me. I kind of just looked at them and I remember like, oh, okay. I looked at them and then I do very vaguely remember like names popping in my head, because I did come back upstairs and I told my dad later on, and I don't really remember this, but my parents had remembered it, that I had actually come up and said, so-and-so, was downstairs and I had a story, I had a story, and they were like, who are you talking about? But then my dad had actually figured out that I was actually talking about one of the people who were deceased, and
Mhm,
so
mhm.
I had tuned into that at a really young age. And yes, one of my cousins said that. She said, but she would tune it out because she lived there. And she said it was very overwhelming and she couldn't listen to that all the time. It was just
No,
too much, and
way too much. Yeah, it's like having company in your house 24/7.
in
I
your
was
house, in your mind,
in your mind.
24/7.
Yeah, exactly. Like no escaping it. I was thinking as you're describing this, I was thinking about the TV series 6 Feet Under, that was that HBO
Yes.
series, which I absolutely love. And one of the things I really loved about it was at the very beginning when there was just like they were having that kind of communication with the spirits of the dead and that interaction that was happening. As things went on, they didn't tend to do that as much later in the series when it got more into the like the hot mess dramas between all the family members. But at the
Exactly.
beginning, there was more of that. And I really, really, really loved that. Um, I'm curious. I'm wondering actually. So you were saying that like you come from legacy. You come from funerary arts legacy.
Mhm.
And I'm actually wondering like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it are people is this sort of like people who end up in the funerary arts? Is it like is the empathic sensitivity, the psychic ability, the mediumship stuff that happens as a result of being around dead bodies all the time? Or is it that there is a natural predisposition towards these abilities that tended to lead certain families into the funerary arts? I don't know if you know the answer to
I
that, but
don't.
I'm
That's
just
a
kind
great
of
question.
wondering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know because, like I said, I wasn't around it as much as my uncle and my cousins were, but I'm super in tune to things. However, I was around death and loss in my 20s and 30s, so it's like I experienced it later in life on a much, more regular level. I mean, I was, and for me, it was this. So there was a time when I would have to review medical records. I had like 10 hospitals and I would have to travel around to each of the hospitals and review charts. And oftentimes they didn't have a place for me to sit. So they would put me in the morgue because there was a
Wow.
computer down there. And that's when I did notice I started hearing voices. I would hear the earthbound spirits. I would hear their spirits. And people would get really creeped out by that you just spent your whole day in the morgue. And I'm like, yeah, it just became very natural to
Hmm.
me. And then they started having me going to the medical examiner's offices. And I was one of the ones that responded to the Pulse shooting in Orlando. It was the nightclub shooting that was
I just got
several years
chills.
ago.
I
Yeah.
oh
And
no, me and a whole bunch of us up here felt pulse before it happened, we were all like absolutely beside ourselves a couple weeks prior to pulse. And when it finally hit, we were all just like, that was what we were feeling. So that's just interesting because I sort of feel like there was something so
When you got chills,
significant
I
about
got
pulse.
chills.
I'm getting
Yeah.
chills. Like I feel like we just came full circle from something that I've been sort of, so
Putting the
please
pieces
continue.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had been on a vacation. I had gone to Norway with a friend, and I had gotten back the day before, and literally the Pulse shooting had happened. And we were all hands on deck because there wasn't enough staff that wanted to go into the trenches because it was horrific, and so
It was a massacre.
it was a massacre. And not, they called the organ procurement organization because they know that we deal with this stuff regularly, and that emotionally and mentally we could handle this, right? So my friend, I was actually helping out at a medical examiner's office in my territory, but she had called me and said, hey, I need some assistance here. Can you come over and help? And I said, sure, I'll be right there. And I remember Jennifer walking in. So this is one of the top of the line medical examiner offices in Orlando, in Orlando, Florida. And I remember walking in, and when you walk in the door, there's two double doors there. And when those doors swing open, that's where they have all of the bodies, or all of the people. I say bodies because that's what we would call them in the field, but it's
Right.
people, all of the people.
Yeah.
And I remember walking in, this is crazy because my psychic abilities just boom, the moment I walked in. And I hadn't been to this facility. I'd actually been to this facility like a month earlier to visualize an autopsy. However, we didn't have one that day, so I didn't get a chance to see it. So I just got a tour of the facility. Well, the moment I walked in that door and those double doors were there, they swung open the doors, like two of the staff had walked out. And immediately my eyes had scanned through that room, and I saw everyone that was in the Pulse shooting, like in that room. And then I immediately scanned down and saw a shoe, like a sneaker, on the ground, and it had blood on it. And boom, I had an image in my head. It was like sneaker and then this person, it was like immediately I had associated that. So now I'm learning that's called psychometry. It's when you can look at something or feel it and associate it with something. And I am starting to really develop that gift. But at the time, I not only was I immediately had a visual of who that person was in my mind, I also could hear all these whispers going on in my head. And I'm like, are these the people? Is this the staff? But no, then I realized, oh my goodness, it's all of the earthbound spirits that have just been shot out of their bodies. And now they're kind of just congregating here because Pulse, when the medical examiner had actually decided to take the shooter to a different location than to where all of the families were and all of
yeah, that makes
which
sense.
I thought was very compassionate.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And so that was really nice that they did that. So, but with that said, I was just, it overwhelmed me. And I remember my coworker looking at me, she's like, are you okay? She thought I was just overwhelmed by the death, but it really wasn't that. I was picking up on every one of my gifts was just on overdrive.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
I had to step out, of there and just ground myself and be like, okay, can I do this? Like, it's one thing when you're working with one donor one-on-one, but then when you've got 25 or 50, I honestly can't even remember how many there were, because it was so overwhelming that it was like, can I even handle this? So I had to kind of get my wits about me and then be able to go back in and assist, and help people. But that was very traumatic, for everybody involved. And
yes,
but that was also yet another kind of turning point for me in my developing my gifts and even having more understanding of what my gifts are and going deeper into that. Cause I thought, oh, my psychometry is just picking out blankets. And now it's like, oh my goodness,
yeah. I had an experience. One of the first very conscious awareness of psychometry experiences I had was years ago. I was at a retreat, a weekend retreat, and I found a scarf just on the grounds, and I picked up the scarf, and I immediately knew whose it was. Like I just knew. And I was like, and about, so about an hour later, going into the dining hall, I'm like, is this your scarf? And she's like, yeah, how did you know? I was like, I just knew. Like I could tell, I could see you. I just felt it. Like I could feel that this was your scarf. And I've also had the experience of like when we were house hunting, that psychometry ability was definitely not working in my, well, in some ways it was working in my favor, because it had me recognize like there were a couple of houses that were super, super, super wrong and kind of creepy. But one house was really sweet, but it was just the upstairs part of it, like there was this bedroom, and I stepped across the threshold, and just looking at the bed, I got this incredible download of all this information about what was happening. And it is really quite spectacular to be able to look at an object and get so much information, which is actually one of the reasons why I'm a really big fan for periodically scanning your space and decluttering, because not only do we have it for paranormal stuff or for other stuff, but like you're constantly getting information from the objects around you. Might as well choose good objects instead of neutral or icky ones.
I
Yeah.
absolutely agree. And I think, my training ground was going into a hospitals every day, going into medical examiners' offices, going into funeral homes, going into all of these. But with that said, it was activating my nervous system to a point of burnout. It was just because I hadn't gotten to a point of understanding that I can command them out of my energetic field. Like I don't have to sit there and be lashed and bashed by every earthbound spirit.
Right.
I can take my own sovereignty back and say, hey, and set boundaries. And so I think once we learn, that we're empathic, we understand what our abilities are, we do have power over them. And the younger version of myself didn't think I had power over it, because it was actually consuming me and draining my energy without me even recognizing it. And I do remember as a child, I'd come home and sleep. I love to sleep. My mom's like, all you do is sleep. And I think I was just, at that time, I was transmuting a significant amount of energy. And now it's like, okay, I can set up those boundaries for myself and say, I'm not tuning into this today. This is not what I want to communicate with. But I've been on a few paranormal investigations here locally. And it's been fun because it really allows you to tune into your gifts a little bit more and have a deeper understanding. But the more you do that, the more you realize I have more gifts than what I thought I had.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Voila, psychometry.
Well, and I actually find that as empaths, we often can receive the gifts or the abilities from the world around us. So where I think that a lot of times people who might be psychic or intuitive but not empathic will be able to, like, they might have clairsentience or clairaudience or clairvoyance. But I find that, like, one of the things I've noticed is that as an empath, if I'm communicating with somebody from the other side, I will often experience information through their dominant sensory processing, that I'll experience information through kind of like the predominant filter that the other person uses. And I think as a result, that the more we sort of allow ourselves to be open to receiving, especially once we have some boundaries in place, that we do have the ability to access like many, if not all of the clairs.
Absolutely. And it's like and I do personally feel I've been actively working on my clairvoyance, and I know that's a powerful gift for me, but there's a reason I shut it off. And whether I shut it off in this lifetime or previous lifetimes, I'm still working on that. And it is starting to slowly open itself back up. But I do see, I don't see full on, well, okay, I did in the hospital, I would see shadow beings oftentimes. I would be in the office late at night, maybe 3 a.m, because I'd have to go in and work with the night shift. And my coworker's chair, who wasn't in there, would fly across the room. And I'm like, okay, because it had rollers on it and it would roll across the room. And I would see shadow beings constantly. So I know that I have those abilities to see it in my external, but most of the time my clairvoyance is within my mind's eye.
That's my experience too. And
Yes.
I actually have a theory for myself. I spent my the first like 23 years of my life developing my skills as a visual artist and looking at things really precisely in the world around me, I actually believe that I trained my eyes to see the world in such a concrete way because I was drawing still lives and I was doing portraits and all this, that if it was almost like I sort of filtered out the extraneous information and
Mhm.
instead, but so I've always been able to, like, I can see auras and I can see energy in my mind, but I but I don't see it. Like, I know there are people who like see it as if they're watching like, CGI in on a
Yeah.
like on like a Harry Potter movie or something like that, like where you can really see it. And I've never, like I don't see like a big purple haze all around you as the aura, but I can sense what somebody's aura is. And actually it's interesting as I was saying purple haze because I'm actually seeing a lot of rose around you. Like you've got a great
Oh,
deal of
interesting.
rosiness in your aura right now. But it's
So now
so
I'll ask you this, Jennifer, when you see rose, this has happened to me. If you see rose, do you smell roses? Because I've had that happen where someone will have a yellow aura and I taste lemons and it's
ooh.
like that kicks in where the taste factor, or someone may be holding a trapped emotion and I taste bitterness in my mouth and I know immediately they're bitter about something.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
do you ever have that happen?
I have not personally had happen, but I can smell certain things and it's like, but it's more like this energetic signature of a smell. So it's not necessarily again, it's sort of more of like this etheric smell as opposed to a concrete smell. But something you said, I want to circle back around to. You were talking about sovereignty as a medium and about the fact that one of the things that's so important to realize is that we get to set boundaries with the dead. And
Yeah.
my personal experience is that they're very much like dogs and children. If you are clear with them about what your boundaries are, they're very respectful of the boundaries. But you just need to have those boundaries. And I
Mhm.
think that a lot of times we don't even know that we're allowed to say, hey, I'm really trying to sleep right now. I'm more than happy to get this information from you later, but right now, like, I need sleep. Please, like move along. Let me and generally it's like it's just so I was actually having an amazing conversation and interview with another person that's going to be airing later this season, where we were talking about she's an experiencer who has had a lot of comes from multi-generational extraterrestrial visitations. And one of the things that she realized is, I mean, she had felt like a victim to these ETs that were constantly hovering and surrounding her and coming and visiting her. And then finally, isn't it, a few years ago, she was finally like, would you please just stop? Like, this is really upsetting to me. And the being was like, oh, sorry, I had no idea. Like, they're just like, okay, no problem. And I think we so frequently assume we cannot set a boundary with these spirits or with these entities, like that we're not allowed to say, no, this is my limit, this is my boundary, or I'm off duty right now. If you need to talk to somebody, go find somebody else.
Exactly. Because, we are in the third dimension and they're in other frequencies, right?
Right.
So we need rest. We need to sleep and they're all active in the night, And
Yeah.
so it's like, I've had to do that. And I've actually had an ET experience as well. It showed up, as an apparition in front of me in Western New York, which I think Western New York in itself is its own conversation about how spiritual the land is and how many of the settlers came over, and that's where a lot of religions came from, a lot of spirituality started. So in
Joseph
itself,
Smith, and yeah, I mean, and
the
then like
Mormons, yes.
Rochester, the
Mhm.
Mormon, then like yeah, we were one of the years, a friend and I were driving back from Starwood, and going across the state, and there was all of this really curious heat and lightning and weird, like just weird activity going on in the sky. And one of the things, it happened that the friend who was driving with me worked for organization out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, that was doing research on extraterrestrials. And what she was saying was that it's very common for these sort of demonstrations or displays of like big clouds and kind of heat lightning is usually hiding things.
Yes.
But that was one of some of the most overt stuff I've ever seen. It was in Western New York State.
It
So
is. And so
right there
I
with
had
you.
gone home to visit my grandmother, excuse me, or not visit my grandma. She had passed away. Okay. So I stayed in her home, her 1900s ranch farmhouse, all by myself, all by myself. And it's a 2-story house. Well, she was driving me crazy on the other side. I mean, it was kind of a joke, but she was 91 when she passed. So we had actually talked about how you were going to haunt me. You know, that's what I'd say to her. And she goes, well, I'm going to make you laugh. She was messing with my phone. She was moving things, just some crazy things that were happening. Well, her and our connection was ladybugs. And I would tell her, show me ladybugs, you know.
My grandmother's connection was also ladybugs. And when and the timing of this is amazing. We bought our house 21 years ago, and we closed on Halloween. My grandmother was an atheist who did not believe in any of this hooey. She thought it was really ridiculous. But I had said to her again and again, you know, in the last like 10 years of her life, well, if I'm right and you're wrong, you're very welcome to come and visit me. And, you know, like, you're welcome to come and hang. And wouldn't you know, the moment we walk into this brand new house, and we had used money from her death because she had died about, 7 months before we purchased the house. So we used money from that I had inherited from her for our down payment on the house. And we close on Halloween or Samhain, and we walk in, and there in the middle of the kitchen sink, there's a ladybug on the faucet just looking right up at me. And I'm like, well, hello, thank you for conceding that I'm right and you're wrong.
It's funny, Jennifer, my grandmother was the same. She didn't believe in all this hoopla, because I told her, when you pass, you're going to communicate with me. I'm going to be the grandchild that is going to listen to you, you know? And so this is so funny. About 2 weeks ago, it was the day of my grandmother's death 2 years ago. It was back in September. And that morning I looked at a picture of her and said, all right, Grandma, I'm going to go on a hike with some friends, and I want you to show me that you're with me. I want you to show me a ladybug. I said, a ladybug. So we get out there and we start hiking. And I told my friends before we started, hey, my grandma passed 2 years ago today, and she's going to show us a ladybug. And they're like, okay. They go, it's September. There's no way we're going to see a ladybug. I'm like, we're going to see a ladybug. Well, we get hiking, and then we get to a point where there's maybe a little area with 10 ladybugs. My friend points it out. She's like, look, there's 10 ladybugs. And I'm like, oh, my grandma, she showed up. Jennifer, I'm not even joking. We continued on our hike. We probably hiked for another 40 minutes. Well, by the time we were heading back, we had gotten to a point where there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of ladybugs. They were all over the logs. They were flying around us. They were on my clothes. I had gotten home and was pulling ladybugs out of my clothes. Well, after we had seen all these ladybugs, I said, all right, Grandma, I'm done with the ladybugs. Like, this is ridiculous. I mean, you showed up. I see it. Now show me dragonflies. Well, as we were walking back to our cars, we saw 20 dragonflies circled around us. And so, you know, we have the ability to tune in with the other side. We do. You know, it's just like a radio frequency. It's really just communicating with them, and then believing that they can communicate back, and then being open to receiving that message that they send to us. And, you know, the funny thing is, she showed us, you know, the 10, but then it took her a little bit to manifest. But when she did, they were all over the place.
Over the place.
And I had a video. It's been circulating a lot on my page, and people are like, that's amazing.
That is so cool. And her sense of humor is so obvious or evident too. She's like, you want one ladybug? Let me show you. I got some serious.
I'm not joking around.
Well, and interestingly, I can't recall if it was earlier, it was in the podcast interview that I was being interviewed for today, or whether it was yesterday, but within the last 24 hours, this is the second manifestation of ladybug. And like, very specifically, like ladybugs as communicators, ladybugs as messengers. And so, because like a ladybug just like the person who was on the other, on the other Zoom screen, like just was like a ladybug just happened to appear. And I was like, oh yeah, yep, that's them talking. So it's like, it just feels like there, and the fact that your grandmother and my grandmother both use ladybugs to communicate with us is so interesting. My grandmother actually did an interesting thing because um, a couple years later, so I was doing a shamanic journeying piece, and we were communicating. We were going to this place where the ancestors tend to congregate, where you can communicate with them.
Mhm.
And so I went over and I was like talking, I went to see her, and my grandmother made it very abundantly clear that she didn't really care to have much of a conversation with me because I was not from her daughter's line, that the only people that mattered to her were the matrilineal, like the daughters of,
Wow.
like the daughter, like was her daughters and her daughter's daughters and her daughter's daughters. Like that, they were, her sons, she didn't really care about, like, or her sons, offspring. And then but then she basically told me that she was going to be reincarnating as the firstborn child of my cousin's firstborn child, who at the time was like 18 years old, and there was no way in hell she was going to get pregnant.
Uh-huh.
Go figure, 6 months later, she's pregnant. And it was so spectacular because from the get-go, when I saw this child, from the moment I looked at like this, like not necessarily like they don't look physically identical, but their energy signature was identical.
Oh,
And but it was like this child was raised in a magical, progressive, like family where she had, like, my grandmother was raised as an only child, and my grandmother was raised in like she just so many things, and just the time, like she was born in the early 1900s, so many things that she didn't get to do, and getting to see her soul be realized now is so exciting, because it's like she gets to be the wild, creative, magical person. Because like my grandmother didn't believe in magic, but she did believe in mermaids, and she did believe in fairies, but she especially believed in mermaids. And so she was constantly sending us out to look for mermaids in the rocks and things, because
that's
she
neat.
lived on the ocean. But yeah, so I just struck by like
A lot of
how your
synchronicity
grandmother and
here.
my grandmother are kind of having a conversation here, both of them conceding that maybe we're a little bit more right than they were, which if your grandmother is like mine, that's a hard thing to
I'm like,
concede
yep, grandma, I would tell her that. I'm like, you are going to communicate with me. And she's like, whatever. She goes, all I care about is getting off this earth right now. I want to go see your grandfather, because he had passed away 40 years earlier, so she was ready to check out. And then once she did, she came back full force to come visit me. But
Oh
it
yeah.
was funny because my dad's like, she doesn't communicate with me, but I'm like, I'm not sure you're open to it like I am.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's also the whole thing of second guessing oneself. And, like I have had the experience of, well, and then also grief, how deeply or profoundly grief can inhibit our ability to feel the depth of the message. Like it's kind of like I have a friend who lost their spouse, and even when their spouse is like has reached out through, like has literally had mediums call them on the phone and say, I'm here, I'm watching you, I'm
Oh,
loving you, I'm all about this, they are so heartbroken that their attitude is, yeah, but you're not here.
no.
And so I think that grief will also really can contribute to why it can be harder to really feel that connection and listen to them as
Yeah,
well.
I agree with that, Jennifer, because grief is a denser emotion and it holds you deeper into the third dimension. And
Yeah.
so that's why when you think of your deceased loved ones, you want to think of the joyful times with them, because that's oftentimes when you will have that connection, because you're in a higher frequency. and you have more of that ability to see through the veil, so to speak.
Or I would say, if you let the grief flow, it doesn't feel dense to me at all. It feels really beautiful, and it feels there's an elegance and an exquisiteness to just being present with the grief. What I've noticed is when we get up into our head and grief becomes a narrative and a story where we're perseverating about it, and we're forming a lot of conclusions about it, and we're also turning it into because of this is what's going to happen for the rest of my life, that it feels to me like it's not necessarily the emotion of grief itself as much as it's our resistance to grief, our projections on grief, and all of and sort of the mental heaviosity that we add to it that I've seen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's like the story of grief. And I would see this with with the families. I would see some of the families healing faster than others.
Yeah.
And it really had to do with how they were telling their story. Were they vacillating in the grief and the pain, or were they actually telling the story of their loved one in a joyful light, and you could
Right.
really see how some of them would move on through that. I mean, they were still sad, but they weren't in that heavy, deep
Right.
sadness, not moving.
Well, and personally, I actually, and this has happened enough times now where I've been around, I actually experience the ecstatic bliss. Like I experience like the ecstasy of being released, and the absolute, like the light, just like that period of time right after somebody crosses over for a couple weeks where everything is just flooded with light and flooded with like possibility. And to me it's like best ice cream orgasm ever. Like it's just so ecstatic. And it's funny because for me, I'm aware that like my experience of it is really different than a lot of other people's experience, because they are so kind of entrenched in the grief that they can't necessarily feel the freedom and the ecstasy and the relief that comes. But also, I think that's the difference too between spirits that have crossed over
Yeah.
and spirits on the other hand that are sort of stuck earth side and are really confused, like the pulse victims.
Yeah, because we as humans hold them here when we can't let them go and allow them to leave us. Then we actually kind of tether them here to us. And I think that's working in death for all of those years, and then kind of developing my spiritual gifts. It's really allowed me to see death in a different way. They aren't gone. It's just an energy transference. Yes, they're gone in the physical, but they're still there energetically. And I have just as many conversations with my grandmother now as I did, before when she was here on the earth plane. So
I
I
have more
totally,
conversations with my dad now that he's on the other side, because my
yeah.
dad had suffered a frontal lobe brain injury when he was 4 years old and was a fairly non-verbal person and didn't have, like just and so ironically, he and I have way more of a conversation now that he's on the other side than I did when he was alive, because he tended to be kind of, I mean, your classic sort of father knows best monosyllabic, guy thing. So so I actually have more of a conversation with him now. It's funny, the interview that just went live a couple, just very, very recently with Amy Gray Cunningham, where her husband Chuck, they kind of co-host a podcast called Butterfly Kisses. And Amy and Chuck co-host. And so Amy and Chuck came on the show and had a conversation. It was this year's Halloween show, basically. But his message is very, very similar. It's like we're not gone. It's like we're just in another room. We've shifted over to another dimension.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that he explained it to Amy was in the same way that like you would be in your room watching TV and I'd be in my room watching TV, and we both knew we were in the other room. That's what this is like too. And so, I think it's so incredibly important for all of us to be able to start being open to the possibility that there is more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in our philosophy, and that love is stronger than death.
Absolutely. And it
Yeah.
reminds me of the movie Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey. At the end, he's communicating with his daughter. He's in another realm, but he's actually pushing the book off of the shelf. In her reality, she's seeing the book move falling on the ground, but in his reality, he's seeing, he's pushing it, and they're looking at the clock. And that's what it reminds me of. It's just, they're there. We just physically can't see them, but we can tune into them with all of our other, abilities that each and every one of us has. And so it's, we all have those. We all have every single ability. It's just, do we work on developing them, and which ones do we notice are more fine-tuned than other ones? And so,
Well, and which ones do we love?
yeah,
Which ones do we love? What is exciting? I mean, I do think that there's sort of, we all have certain talents and predilections and inclinations. And it's like, lean into what is exciting to you. Don't just try to force yourself to be everything. Lean
yes.
into the things that are exciting, that feel really good.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
so key, is what feels good to you. Because if you want all of your gifts, at full capacity, you'd have a really difficult time living here on earth. I think
Yeah.
we'd be hearing everything, we'd be seeing everything, feeling everything, smelling, tasting. It would be overwhelming.
It
I
would
don't think
be
our nervous
overwhelming.
system could handle it.
Well, and something that I've been really sort of thinking about lately is like the spectrum of frequency in sound and light, that as human beings, we hear a very limited band of the frequencies of sound. And and visually, we see a very limited band of the light frequencies that are available. As anything, I think I've heard we see 1% of the
Yes.
frequency of
Oh,
light that's available. And so it's sort of like, if you start thinking about like our capacity to perceive, like we're functioning at 1%, even if we dial up and start functioning at 3%, that is going to be a substantially larger amount of information coming to us than we are calibrated for right now.
yeah, absolutely. And I noticed that when my clairaudience, it's funny. When I went home to visit my family, one of my best friends had said, I remember you in third grade holding your ears all the time saying, it's too loud, turn it off. And I think at that time, my clairaudience was really amped up, and I had shut that off because by the time I was an adult, I had hearing issues. I had a hard time hearing. It was like I was underwater. And now I've started to develop that gift again. And I notice I can hear things that other people can't hear. I'm like, don't you hear that noise all the way across the park? It's like, I always joke, I'm like on Twilight, Edward and Bella,
Mhm.
they can hear things from a mile away. And it's like, I'm noticing I'm picking up on things, different frequencies. Cause children, when we used to do those hearing tests, children could pick up on different tones and tunes than adults can. And I do think it's really just developing that gift and ability again, and opening ourselves back up to it, because 90% of us shut these gifts off when we're children because it's on overdrive, and a lot of us can't handle it.
It's like, well, and we don't have anybody teaching us boundaries. We don't have anybody giving us any support. We don't have any, and we also often are not receiving any validation or acknowledgement of the fact that this stuff is real. We're being told this is hooey, this is your overactive
Imagination.
imagination, just all of the different ways that we we are not being given any resources or tools to handle it. As you mentioned, the whole thing of like coming into hearing, one of the things, and this is kind of like a complete adjunctive thing, but I'm feeling guided to mention it, is one of the things that I'm hearing a lot of is just in terms of like, as we are going through sort of the quote ascension symptoms, that a lot of people are experiencing like what would be diagnosed as tinnitus or
Yeah.
tinnitus, but that we're having like like ringing in the ears. And pretty much since the onset of COVID, but especially like about a month before my dad died in April of 2020, I've just been struck by like I am constantly hearing these tones and these frequencies that are coming through. And I'm wondering if that's been something you've also been experiencing, because I've been talking, I mean, a lot of people are talking about this as well, that we're, yeah.
Absolutely. And it was something that I was experiencing, but I did a heavy metal cleanse, and now I'm doing minerals, trace minerals,
Mhm.
and I noticed it stopped. So I wondered if that had something to do with it, but I do notice sometimes it will happen and I can sense a presence. depending on what ear is ringing, sometimes I can clairessentially sense a presence there. And I've kind of intuitively picked up that it's a being, that there's a being there that's in my presence, but I'm not getting the constant ear ringing like I used to, mainly because I have been doing cleanses and whatnot, and that kind of took away. But there was a time I felt like I had SOS going on in my ears. It was like beep, 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 all the time. And I'm like, I can't get this to stop. And it wasn't in any one ear or the other. It was constant. And so I got to a point, maybe I thought, maybe I leveled myself out in frequency for a minute, and now I'm able to kind of hear it, but I'm not recognizing it as much. But I do recognize it. Me and my friends, we do what's called CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. It's when we get together and meditate, and we actually communicate with extraterrestrials or beings. And so that's when I notice my ears will ring sometimes, is that when they come into the presence, or we see the craft, or we haven't really seen a being like Stephen Greer has, like a being actually manifest, but we've seen many craft. And that's when I do notice my ears will ring. I don't necessarily notice it with earthbound spirits or disembodied spirits. It's more extraterrestrial is when I'm
experiencing it more with angelic presences.
Oh,
is what I'm experiencing. And what I've noticed is that, I have a fairly consistent and persistent, tones in my right ear mostly. But what I've noticed is if I listen, like if I stop and I listen, like if I actually take time and I stop doing all the things and I pause and I slow down, what I find happens again and again is that then it kind of has this way of sort of like, I kind of get the transmission and then it subsides.
So like a download.
So I'm finding that as long as I honor it and I listen to it, it is coming through. And my sense for myself, because I've done a lot of heavy metal cleansing and I've done, and the sort of the remineralizing and things like that, the timing of it felt very relevant. And it just, the sense I've always gotten is that this is not physiological, that it is spiritual and that it's coming through. And and just, so for me, just that willingness to listen has been such an incredibly important thing.
Yeah. And I can't put my finger on what made it go away, but I guess I just kind of correlate it with that, because and I'm also taking ORMUS, orbitally rearranged monoatomic elements, which they raise your frequency really quickly. So after I did all that heavy metal detoxing, then I started to reintroduce the ORMUS, which is what Jesus used in the Bible, the manna, I guess. So yeah, so maybe that played a role in it too. It's all holistic, so it's all
fascinating that. So I've been recently been guided to stop saying daily bread and instead in the Lord's Prayer say daily manna.
There you go.
That is much more specifically what we're talking about. Bread, it's not about something that gets stored in a granary. It's about the idea of the manna that's available in this one, single moment, or in this moment. So God, all of these pieces that are just weaving together. Tonia, I cannot believe how fast time has whipped by. This has just been such a rich, delicious, wonderful conversation. Oh, I had one other thought I wanted to throw out there as you were talking about earth spirit, humans holding the spirits here. I thought, I wonder if all of the indignation, all of the grief, all of the stories that we as a nation, or maybe even as a world, were telling about Pulse ended up really causing the spirits to stay earthbound, because there was such an incredibly large amount of emotional expression, both in favor of the victims, and then some people kind of, giving them the hairy eyeball and sending all kinds of negativity their way. But just thinking about the magnitude of emotional energy being sent at those people, I wonder if that was part of what made them so stuck. Like, not just the shock, of this, and probably many of them were intoxicated too, which I think makes it harder to recognize that you're dead. But
Yeah.
just I just wonder, as you were saying that, I just was like, I wonder how much that also contributed to their stuckness.
Yeah, 100%. I believe in that. I do a lot of grid work. So I do a lot of land clearing.
Mhm.
And specifically, Butte, Montana is an area that has a tremendous amount of hauntings and paranormal activity. And I was watching a show with a man who actually kind of does similarly what me and my friends do. We go around and clear the land. We go through cemeteries and different sacred sites, ley lines. And one of the things that he had gotten from the spirit box was the reason why Butte was so haunted is because the people continue to share the stories. And so I do feel that stories, Salem, I'm actually doing a remote viewing show on Friday, about the Salem witch trials. Anytime we are sharing specific stories about locations, it's harnessing an energy, it's anchoring in an energy of the land, of the people, of everything that's passed on. And so you look at all of these haunted homes, all these haunted lands, a lot of it is because we as society continue to share the stories behind it, and stories are what fuels them and keeps them alive. Yeah, so
I've
giving them
also
permission to move on.
I've also noticed here in Maine, because I moved from a very densely populated part of Massachusetts up to Maine. And one of the things that I noticed is that there's a lot more hauntings here in Maine than there are in Massachusetts. And I actually, one of my theories is also that the ghosts, when you don't have as much of like urban sprawl and sort of the craziness, that it's almost like with a lower population, there's more space for ghosts to manifest and to make themselves known. So I've noticed a correlation between population and hauntings as
And you
well.
wonder, if nature, because trees are like antennas and they can
Yeah.
harness and bring in energy. You've got water there in Maine.
Yeah.
It's like a natural orgone or organite that's kind of fueling that, because you've got Oak Island up in that area. There's a lot of kind of strange
Oh, and
paranormal
I mean,
activity.
I personally live a couple miles away from a place called Pineland that has like quite the stories. And fortunately, it's the energy of Pineland is starting to really shift because people are sort of coming in and using it in a really, really different way. And it's lightening up
That's
quite a bit.
good.
But yeah,
Mhm.
Maine has some really interesting hauntings and fascinating stuff going on there.
It does. And so it's just interesting. I do think the more earthbound spirits you have, they kind of congregate together, which then can create stronger manifestations, because, and if they're feeling certain emotions, like if they were killed traumatically and they're holding on to anger or resentment, guilt, bitterness, then it's really going to anchor them here.
Yeah.
And so, and I noticed this with patients that wouldn't pass, that we had removed from the ventilator. The moment you give them permission, then 9 times out of 10, they'll pass on. And that's what I told my dad with my grandmother. She wasn't letting go. And I said, Dad, you need to call her, give her permission to go. And within 6 hours, she had passed. So,
Mm.
I think that's a huge thing for us here on the earthly, realm, to be able to give permission for our loved ones to pass, go to the light.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, that was one of the things that I learned in some of my shamanic training is like, if you are encountering an earthbound spirit, tell them to look up, call on their ancestors to help them and tell them to look up. Like, and sometimes I find too, even just being like, did you know you're dead? Like, did
Exactly.
you know you're dead? Like, it's time to cross over. It's
And I think
okay.
that's why there's
Yeah.
so many in the hospitals, because it's so traumatic, and that
Yes.
they get locked in the hospital because they
Yes.
don't even know they're dead.
Right.
And that's a whole nother topic, is the walk-ins, the walk-in souls that I would witness, in and out of the hospital. But that's why I think those things happen, is because the spirits are looking for a vessel, an
Mm-hmm.
avatar, so to speak. And
Mm-hmm.
then that's
Mm-hmm.
when they kind of pop in and out.
Mm, mm, mm. Tanya, I could have this conversation. I mean, I could talk for hours with you about this this is just the juice and uh, just love, love, love this conversation. And we're really at that point. So I have a question for you. One of the things I really love to ask everybody at the end of the interview is, if you could go back in time, actually, we are going to go back in time. We're going to broadcast, because I really believe like podcasts, we're broadcasting a signal out into the world. So we're broadcasting beyond time and space. So I want to send a message back to young, struggling, empathic Tonia.
Yeah.
What does she need to hear? What do you need her to know? What is her message?
Yeah. Young empathic Tonia needs to follow her authenticity, not be wavered by others, continue to follow her truth, and not be afraid to step into the unknown. And because I think there were times young empathic Tonia got really caught up in the emotions and feelings of others and didn't really recognize what it was that she wanted. And
so if you were looking right into her face and you were going to be the wiser, older part that is giving her guidance, what specifically, like, what would you tell, what words does she need to hear from you?
I love you, and you are beautiful just the way you are.
Awesome. So Tonia, before I let you go, how can people get in touch with you?
Absolutely. So like you said in the beginning, I do quantum healing hypnosis sessions. I also do EFT tapping, emotion code sessions. So I have a personal healing session that oftentimes it's just guided by the client's energy. So it can include tapping, emotion code, light language, intuitive readings, a whole variety of things. And so you can find out more about my sessions on my website. It's www.thesoulcafe.org. And I'm also the host of the Existential Empath podcast. So check that out as well. I basically just teach people how to tap into their own inner healer naturally and intuitively. And I have beautiful guests like you, Jennifer. And I love to be able to have dialogues like this, because it's so imperative for
it's so it's so nourishing for our souls too. And especially in a time where we're being divided, and we're being, we're people feeling isolated. These conversations are just like they're soul food.
It really is. And so for all of your listeners out there too, I have a discount code, empath15. It'll save you 15% on your first personal healing session.
And is that all capitals, or
yeah. However,
empath 15? I will include that, you guys. So you guys, this is going to be included in the show notes, all of this information. So you can come back over to empathicmasteryshow.com and find all this information, so that you guys can go connect with Tonia, listen to her awesome podcast, and tell her I sent you. Yeah. Tonia, thank you again. Thank you so much. This has just been so rich.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate you having me on.
Mm-hmm.